This book titled And the Witnesses Were Silent. It's about the German Evangelical Church and how Hitler used it to gain power in the 1920s and 30s. It was very expensive, it's very rare, and I haven't seen another copy available since I bought it. This book answers the question, was Hitler atheist? So let's give this a read and see what it says. This is not part one. This stands independently of the others, though. I will give context if it's necessary. Chapter 3, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, is one of the main opponents in the Christian Evangelical Church opposed to Hitler. There were others, but the complaints largely revolved around who's allowed to get baptized in the church rather than treatment of the Jews. Bonhoeffer genuinely fought anti-Semitism, though. As early as April 14th, 1933, Bonhoeffer wrote his friend Erwin Sutz that the Jewish question has caused the church no end of trouble. Here, the most sensible people have lost their heads and their entire Bible. Jewish question is like saying the immigrant problem, basically. How do we deal with the immigrant problem? How do we deal with the Jewish question? Also, April 1st, 1933, was the start of a boycott. Hitler had just taken control, and we're walking out of a chapter right now that talked all about the April 1st boycott. Things started getting real ugly for Jews at this point. You weren't banned from speaking your mind yet. That would be a little bit later. So everybody who's like supporting Hitler or not opposing what's happening to Jews, they're doing it because that's how they feel, not because they have social pressure. It's difficult to measure how much Bonhoeffer's public stand and attitudes toward the Jews were motivated by personal considerations. Two of those closest to him, his brother-in-law, Gerhard Liebholz, and his friend and colleague, Franz Hildebrandt, were non-Aryan. Non-Aryan is, of course, the term they used for Jews. It was largely Jews, but that technically also covered, like, black people and stuff. Black people were not treated as poorly as the Jews, but they weren't, ideal either in the Aryan mind. So Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law and close friend were both non-Aryan, likely Jewish. Liebholz was threatened by the state's anti-Jewish legislation. Hildebrandt would be affected by the church measures. I've talked about a lot of this stuff in other episodes, so I'm not going to go through all of it all over again, but I'm just going to insert a little bit of commentary here or there to kind of provide context if you missed the others. At this point, the government had just started passing anti-Jewish legislation, and the Evangelical Church adopted what they called the Aryan paragraph from the state's laws. They adopted it into their church rules when they didn't have to. No one was requiring that of them. They did it because they didn't like Jews, effectively. The Aryan paragraph basically said, Jewish converts to Christianity are not allowed to participate in ministry. So they can't be pastors or anything. Can't be like musicians or have any kind of higher level role in churches at all. Hadn't banned them from getting baptized yet, but they were not allowed to be involved on a higher level. Bonhoeffer's own personality probably helped him become free of prejudice to a breathtaking degree. As a result, he became increasingly isolated from his friends and his church over the years. Emotional and theological prejudices led, quote, the most sensible people to lose their heads and their entire Bible, end quote. Even before the April 1st boycott of Jews, Bonhoeffer had worked on 6 theses about the problem of the church and the Jews. These were written for the Berlin Church Study Group led by Pastor Gerhard Jacobi. Bonhoeffer used the definition of Jewish Christianity that had originated with Paul. Since the people of Israel had been established by the law of God, not by race, one could not become a racial Jew. There's another hang-up with this whole thing. Hitler was separating Jews into race rather than a religious camp. Churches historically have been deeply tribal and deeply othering and hated minority groups and treated them like trash. However, a lot of the time, church leadership, like in the Catholic Church, the higher you go, the more likely it is that they're going to be negative about groups only because those groups are not Christian or they're not Catholic or whatever. Not because they hate black people necessarily, although they may. So Bonhoeffer's complaint here is that Hitler was separating Jews into a new race, a different race, when there's no reason to separate them out like that. I mean, they looked identical to Germans in most cases. You had to like find birth certificates and search through all kinds of government records to see if there was a Jewish person. It's not something you could immediately identify like you could with like a black person, for example. Point is, separating them by race was absurd, and Bonhoeffer was complaining about it. Bonhoeffer concluded that one could become a Jew only through acceptance of the law. Quote, thus, from the perspective of the Church of Christ, it's not the people of Jewish race baptized as Christians who belong to Jewish Christianity. Rather, the Jewish Christian is one who lets membership in the people of God, the Church of Christ, be determined by compliance with the divine law. So he's saying it's not the church that chooses to allow Jews in, it's the Jews that choose to become part of the church, right? Is that what he's saying? By analogy, the Jewish Christian prototype would be realized by the point where the church made membership contingent on divine law or one proclaimed as divine, such as the law of racial unity. Any ecclesiastical community that excluded members who did not satisfy a racial law would have to be designated Jewish Christian. According to Bonhoeffer, a strict Arian German Christian pastor who sought to exclude non-Arian Christians from the church inadvertently made himself a Jewish Christian. Wow, that's fascinating. So I think it's saying, according to like church doctrine, if you defend Jews, then you classify yourself as Judaism by doing so, or as Jewish. That's fascinating. The April 1st boycott interrupted these reflections. By the way, I think I mentioned, but April 1st boycott was a massive boycott of Jewish stores, and there were beatdowns and riots and all kinds of ugly things, and the outside world saw that happening and were just disgusted by it. So that's what they're referencing here. The April 1st boycott interrupted these reflections, Bonhoeffer's reflections, I guess. Through his brother-in-law, Reich judicial counselor Hans von Dohnanyi, Bonhoeffer learned of the impending legislation concerning non-Aryans. He revised his theses, adding a preface in which he explored the church's responsibilities for the state's actions and the consequences of this with regard to the Jewish question. This introduction became known as the essay, The Church and the Jewish Question. Okay, so Bonhoeffer compiled his theses into an essay called The Church and the Jewish Question, I guess. Interesting. Bonhoeffer stressed the church's unconditional obligation to the victims of every social order, even those who do not belong to the Christian congregation. The ultimate action possible for the church consisted of, quote, not only binding up the wounds of the victims under the wheel, but stopping the wheel itself, end quote. Bonhoeffer did not know that one day this wheel would crush him. Quote, his energies were wholly absorbed in combating the Arian clause, for he believed that only if everything were risked would a message worthy of proclamation reveal itself, end quote. Right. In another part, we actually quoted the Arian paragraph, like we read the whole thing, and that's what's referencing here. It's just talking about like where people were banned from being part of the church, basically. It started out as people not being allowed to be involved in ministry, not being allowed to be pastors or anything. And then it eventually moved to these people have to run their own churches now. They can't be a part of our churches. And then it moved to these people have lost their right to live and are now going to concentration camps. And after that happened, church doctrine changed to try to remove the Old Testament completely from the Christian Bible. And then German Christianity, German Protestantism started rewriting the New Testament to be less Jewish and more reflective of their beliefs about Arianism and stuff. And they also argued that Jesus was not Jewish. That's where that comes from, if you've ever heard that. It was Bonhoeffer's first public statement in the Kirchenkampf, which means church struggle, on an issue where he believed classical church dogmatics had to be challenged or even reformulated by ethical appeals. Church action, to do good to everyone or to stop the wheel itself, instead of treating the symptoms by binding up the victim's wounds, took precedence over academic disputes. Coming from an unknown 27-year-old assistant professor, such a position was unlikely to earn applause from the princes of the church or to be heard in congregations. Kirchenkampf is what people use to refer to the struggle for Hitler to take over the church, basically, like to morph it into a reich church. Hitler basically had to fight two battles, a political one and a religious one. And this is us watching the religious battle play out. Obviously, Hitler won the religious battle. He co-opted the Catholics and the Protestant church across Germany and across other regions too. It's crazy. The crucial point of the church and the Jewish question, Bonhoeffer's essay, was that Bonhoeffer, in part one, was concerned about the Jews in general, not just the non-Aryan Christians. Right? That was a difference between Bonhoeffer and everyone else. To Bonhoeffer's great regret, the confessing church would confine its concern to the plight of the latter. So the church would focus solely on Christians who converted to Christianity, but had some, their grandparent was Jewish or whatever, but they married into a Catholic family or, a Protestant family, and they got baptized as a Protestant, and hell, maybe that family has a kid. Now that kid has Jewish blood in them in Hitler's eyes, even though the kid was raised as a Christian, baptized as a Christian at a young age, attended Christian everything. It doesn't matter because they have Jewish blood. Those were the people that the church leaders that were opposed to Hitler's plan were complaining about. It wasn't about Jews. Because of the salvation, historical, and missionary aspects of Christian attitudes toward the Jews, Bonhoeffer believed this was a status confessionis, the conversion of Israel. That is to be the end of the period of suffering for this people. From here, the Christian church sees the history of the people of Israel with trembling as God's own free, fearful way with his people. The church knows that no nation in the world can be finished with this mysterious people because God is not yet finished with it. Each new attempt to resolve the Jewish question is thwarted by the salvation historical significance of this people. Still, such attempts must be undertaken again and again, end quote. Yeah, I'm trying to piece this together because this book is written 50 years ago or something, 75 years ago maybe. No, about 50, I guess. It was written 50 years ago. And I'm trying to understand what they're saying here. I think what they're saying is when Jews convert to Christianity, though Jews were sentenced to a life of suffering, that suffering comes to an end when they convert to Christianity. I think that's the point. And no nation in the world can be done with Jews because God isn't done with Jews. Each new attempt to resolve the Jewish question is stopped by the significance of Jews in the religious story, I guess, is what this is saying here. After these preliminary reflections, Bonhoeffer was well prepared to speak on the Aryan paragraph at a large assembly of students at the University of Berlin on June 22nd. The topic was the struggle for the church, aka the Kirchenkampf. He was preceded by Professor Caius Fabricius, a systematic theologian and German Christian, and student pastor Ernst Braunischholz. Fabricius stated that resistance against Judaization was part of maintaining the purity of the German gospel. Oh, is this where they start trying to remove any traces of Jewish anything from the Bible? They do that soon. Compared with the New Testament, he said, the Old Testament had only secondary significance. Yep, that's what this is about. Quote, the Jewish question in the church, however, is of no less importance than in the state. The handful of Jews will be dealt with, sure enough, end quote. After Braunischholz interjected that the Aryan paragraph invalidated the baptismal vow, Bonhoeffer, citing Romans 14, noted the contrast between those of weak faith and those of strong faith. Quote, strong is he who ejects no one. Weak is he who puts a fence around the congregation. Those today who are weak in faith need a racial law, end quote. The strong must be watchful, quote, for it is precisely the weak who are the aggressors, end quote. That's interesting. Yeah, they used a number of different Bible verses to back up their positions, basically. And it seems to me that, the confessing church, the one that's opposed to Hitler, they seemed to be using the Bible most frequently. And the verses that I've seen cited the most were basically Romans chapter 9 through chapter 14. That's where it's established that if you come to Jesus and get baptized in his name, then you can be saved, and that's the end of the story. They also referenced Ephesians. I forget the verse in Ephesians, but we'll eventually get there. In August 1933, Bonhoeffer worked in happy collaboration with Hermann Sass in Bethel, drafting a confession intended to serve as a theological foundation for the confessional groups at the National Synod at the end of September. By the way, I looked it up, and it is pronounced synod. I wondered, because people are yelling at me about it. I think it's pronounced synod. It just means, like, assembly, just a group of people. Commonly used in reference to, like, an assembly of Lutheran or Reformed Church leaders. A passage on the Jewish question was also to appear. To Bonhoeffer's elation, Old Testament scholar Wilhelm Fischer supplied the first draft. Wilhelm Fischer had a big part in this whole thing, too. Bethel is a town in Germany, and throughout the course of this book, you'll find that they have drafts of different rules that they created in different towns. So they call their rules confessions. It's kind of like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and so on. Those things are called confessions also, and people like memorize those when they're little. They're just an affirmation of your beliefs. I believe that Jesus died for my sins, and that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are like one, or 3 in 1, or whatever, that kind of thing. And if you come to Jesus, then you can be saved no matter who you are. Those are the confessions that people have to memorize when they're little. In addition to those, the churches in the area are predominantly Lutheran and Reformed Church, or the predecessor to Presbyterian. They're extremely similar to each other. So being from those religions means that they follow these confessions, and when they create a new rule, they call it a confession. So they're creating something called the Bethel Confession here in Bethel, Germany. Later on, they'll go on to create the Barmen Confession from Barmen, Germany, and some other places. So they met in Bethel, Germany, and wrote a new set of guidelines, basically. It says, Section 6.6 of the first draft of the Bethel Confession was entitled The Church and the Jews, although it concerned only non-Aryan Christians, referring to Jews only insofar as they were to be called to conversion, and those who believe baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. The document emphatically rejected the formation of non-Aryan Christian congregations. Otherwise, a racial law would block entry to the church, and such a church would itself become a legalistic Jewish Christian community. This is the next step. Not creating their own churches is actually a point it was actually a point against anti-Semites, because that was like the next step that anti-Semites were trying to take, force Jews out of the congregations entirely. So Section 6.6 of the Bethel Confession said, they can't create their own congregations. They must remain part of ours. Pastor Fritz von Vogelschwing, director of the Bethel institutions, urged that this initial draft be approved by 20 experts. Among the more conservative Protestants who opposed the German Christians, Vogelschwing was a respected leader. He was their candidate for Reich bishop in the synodal elections of May 1933. In 1517, the Catholic Church ruled the entire area, right? It was Christianity since what's called the Catholicos. Catholic means universal. Catholicos, from the Old French catholique, from Latin catholicus, from ancient Greek universal, according to, and whole. So I think the "o-cost" part means whole, and the Catholic part means universal or orthodox or correct beliefs. So since the Catholicos, which is where Catholicism took over everything, there was no Protestant religion until 1517. Martin Luther comes in and writes down like a big list of like 95 complaints or grievances he had against the Catholic Church. And it was stuff like he didn't like that Catholic priests were selling forgiveness. Like they were charging people money to get their family members to the right hand of God and out of hell. That's straight up crooked. So Luther splits off. This all happened in Germany, by the way. Luther was German. He was a German monk, Catholic monk. Luther splits off and creates Lutheranism. That was the first Protestant religion. John Calvin, around the same time, I think between 1523 and 1535, or somewhere in that vicinity, was writing about like different ideas, different interpretations of scriptures. One of his interpretations was that everything was predestined. Everything happened because God wanted it to happen, and it was all part of his big plan. And if you are supposed to be a Christian, then you will be a Christian. And if not, then you won't be. That was a concept adopted by other denominations in the area, specifically Reformed Church. So in Germany, in the Germanic region, since 1517, Lutheranism and Reformed Church existed together. They controlled different towns because separation of church and state didn't exist at the time. In 1555, there's a Treaty of Augsburg signed with the Catholic Church that basically said it was a capitulation by the Catholic Church. If a political leader in the Germanic region is not Catholic, then the people will follow whatever religion that leader is, basically making it so that church and state are unified no matter what. And as a result, Lutheranism and Reformed Church, being really, really big in the north, controlled entire towns. And Catholicism, pretty big in the south, controlled towns of its own. So Reformed Church and Lutheranism joined together to create kind of a federation of churches, 28 districts total. I believe that Reformed Church made up 6 of those 28 districts. Lutheranism made up 21 of those. I don't remember exact numbers now. I looked it up recently. Lutheranism and Reformed Church joined together to create a federation which was called the German Evangelical Church collectively. And when Hitler came in and sparked this Kirchenkampf, this church struggle, he was trying to co-opt the German Evangelical Church and install Nazis at the top in the leadership positions. And he largely succeeded. Eventually, I think 1933, when we're talking about here, he got a full-blown Nazi to the top from what they called the Brown Synod after brown shirts. We'll talk about them later, too. It was a synod, an assembly of all Hitler supporters. And one of those people, Ludwig Müller, found his way to the very top and got elected as like the Reich church president. And they changed the name of the church from the German Evangelical Church, the Federation. They changed it to the Reich Church. So anyway, that's what they're talking about here. Bodelschwing's recommendation annoyed Bonhoeffer. So I guess Bodelschwing was a respected leader and was their candidate for Reich bishop in the synodal elections of May 1933. And he was the director of Bethel institutions. So Bethel was one of the districts, one of the 28. And when the elections came up for who was going to be president, he was the Reich choice, like the Hitler choice for president. That's what this is saying. So Bodelschwing said that he thinks that the initial draft of this Bethel Confession should be approved by 20 experts. This draft basically said it's against the rules for non-Aryan Christians to create their own congregations. It was working in favor of Bonhoeffer, and Bodelschwing said it should be approved by 20 experts, and that annoyed Bonhoeffer. He foresaw that little would be left of the original draft given such a diverse group of consultants, and that the impending National Synod would be long over by the time final editing was complete. Both these fears were realized, and Bonhoeffer finally withdrew his endorsement of the radically altered final version, particularly because the content and tone of The Church and the Jews, which is his essay, if you remember, Bonhoeffer's, had been radically revised. Although the final version retained the passage barrier between the Jews and the Gentiles is broken down, the Christians still appeared as God's more favored, better children, noting nothing remained of the concept that God had preserved and was especially faithful to a holy remnant of Israel, quote unquote. Holy remnant is a quote from the Bible, and modern Christians in America interpret that as being them, like the modern Christians, not Jews. Find it interesting that that was the interpretation of Bonhoeffer at the time. Like I said, the federation of churches in the region, Lutheran and Reformed Church largely, Reformed Church, of course, being the predecessor to Presbyterian, they were like original. They were freshly split off from Catholicism and had existed ever since the Protestant split happened. So they have a lot of unique, interesting, different interpretations of the Bible that have kind of been like lost to time with other denominations. The tone of the final version was negative, not positive. God was no longer devoted to Israel. It was more a case of not rejecting Israel. The Jewish convert to Christianity entered the true Israel and separates himself from his unbelieving people. The non-Aryan Christian had no inherent right to membership. Instead, the Christian community chose to grant his right. There was no longer an explicit position regarding non-Aryan Christian congregations. The sharpest statement in the first draft had fallen victim to the final editing. Quote, Christians descended from the Gentiles must sooner subject themselves to persecution than abandon in any respect, either of their own free will or through coercion, the ecclesiastical brotherhood with Jewish Christians established through the word and the sacraments. This book words things in a needlessly complex way, so let me think about what that just said. Bonhoeffer wrote the first draft, or at least assisted in the first draft, right? I think it was from his essay on the subject originally, and the final editing was completely different. It said Christians who descended from the Gentiles must sooner subject themselves to persecution than abandon the ecclesiastical brotherhood with Jewish Christians established through the word and sacraments. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what the point is of that, but all right, let's continue. The Bethel Confession was the first failed test in the struggle against the state and the church loyal to the state. Already, the ranks of older and younger theologians could no longer be kept together. Wow, isn't that interesting? It was a split between young and old, huh? That is fascinating. It's always like the boomer generation, right? The boomers of 1930-something. Nah, I'm just kidding. Boomers are fine. Boomers are A-okay in my book. They'd been unable to reach an unequivocal position that opposed the Arian paragraph, not only in the church, but in the state. All of them rejected a radical version of the Arian paragraph, quote, but not, unfortunately, the mild form as well, end quote. Bonhoeffer did not consider abandoning his unconditional opposition to the church, that neither desired nor would enter a total solidarity with Jewish Christian pastors. On the other hand, he was forced to realize, quote, that I would find myself incomprehensibly in radical opposition to all my friends, end quote. This made his decision to go to London, October 1933, that much easier. Quote, a further signal for me was the almost total lack of understanding for the Bethel Confession, on which I'd collaborated really passionately. So, end quote. So he was upset that he put all this time and effort into writing this Bethel Confession, this new set of church rules, and they completely gutted it. They changed it and made it like they retained the anti-Semitic undertones that they wanted, basically. And he was upset by that. Additionally, he noted here, I would find myself incomprehensibly in radical opposition to all my friends. He noted that basically everybody in the church, except for him, was an anti-Semitic nutcase. You know, I've put a lot of thought into this, like, are they to blame? Are Germans of the era, are the church members, the leaders in the church, to blame for their radical, insane anti-Semitic views? It was roughly equivalent to beliefs of the time. Like, the pastors, by and large, didn't have unusual views for their time and place, their culture. Anti-Semitism was just like part of the deal. Do I blame them? For a long time, I didn't blame Germans for getting sucked up into this Nazi stuff because I recognized that it was all just kind of brainwashing and anybody could find themselves there. But after thinking about it, I know this kid. He's like 14 years old or something now. I've known him since he was born. And at about 8, he's always been like kind of a bully, you know? Since he was very little, he was a bully. And now, since 8 years old to now, he is a vile scumbag. This kid is. Hates gay people, hates trans people, hates black people, says the N-word regularly. I mean, this kid's from West Virginia, so. Do I blame him? Yes, I do. You cannot be a vile scumbag like that. I don't care how much indoctrination or brainwashing you were exposed to. Nobody should accept you being a vile scumbag like that. I don't even care how old you are. It's irrelevant to me. So in the same way that this kid puts up Trump flags and complains about gay people nonstop, in the same way that I view him as a vile scumbag who does not deserve my sympathy, I feel the same about these people here. On top of that, these people were grown adults making these decisions. I don't care what the culture was like at the time. It's irrelevant. I have no respect and no sympathy for anybody in this entire book, except for maybe Bonhoeffer. He wasn't even the leader of the Confessing Church. He was number 2. Niemöller was number 1. And he voted for the Nazis in 24, 28, and 33. No sympathy, no respect. Anyway, Bonhoeffer says he'd find himself incomprehensibly in radical opposition to all of his friends. All of his friends were scumbags, vile scumbags, is the point. Bonhoeffer would find this understanding in the ecumenical world. Ecumenical meaning like the outside world, like Lutherans outside of Germany, for example. So he'd find the understanding in other Lutheran churches outside Germany. The conflict illustrated, however, that the early claims of Kirchenkampf, or church struggle, Kirchenkampf scholars, that the confessing church never capitulated on the Arian paragraph were erroneous. Point is, the confessing church believed that the Arian paragraph banning Jews from ministry was a violation of one of their fundamental confessions, one of their original core beliefs since the dawn of time, and that was anybody can come to Jesus. It doesn't matter your age or your race or your anything at all. You can come to Jesus, period. The confessing church believed that that was violated. So they kind of created their own little district within the broader Reich church that was comprised of, at its height, about 2,000 pastors, give or take, out of 18,000 pastors total, over 40 million people. 40 million churchgoers. Bonhoeffer was one of the leaders of the Confessing Church, of course. And it says here, contrary to popular belief, basically, is what it's saying, scholars have claimed the Confessing Church never capitulated on the Arian paragraph, but that's false. That's erroneous. If you haven't heard the preface to this book, you should check that out in part 1. Fascinating stuff, truthfully. It lays it out pretty clearly why everybody seems to think that the Confessing Church supported Jews to their dying breath when they absolutely did not. Preface says, this study is accepted in 1970 as a doctoral dissertation by the Evangelical Theological Faculty at the University of Hamburg. For years it went unpublished, since it contradicted much of the accepted thought among veterans of the church struggle and leading church historians. The issues I examined were considered taboo. My critics accused me of attacking those who'd witnessed courageously on behalf of the Christian confessions and principles of faith. It wasn't until the early 80s that somebody basically paid for this to be published. And a second edition was published in 1993. Edition 1, 87, edition 2, 93. So we're talking a period of 15 years between when it was written and when it was published originally. The point is that there was a lot of pushback to this information getting out there. A lot. And this is such a propagandized area of history. What we're reading here is an honest, truthful evaluation of what happened at the time without propaganda being slipped in. So, contrary to popular belief, the Arian paragraph was accepted by the Confessing Church, is the point. We'll talk about this later, but the way that they got around, the way that they justified using the Arian paragraph is they believed that Jews were inferior to other people. So they basically applied the same rules to Jews as they did to mentally disabled people. Mentally disabled people can't be pastors at a church because they're incapable of it. Jews are also mentally deficient and inferior, and for the same reasons they can't be part of it. So that's how the Confessing Church justified it. basically. Bonhoeffer still did not believe that the struggle on behalf of the Jews was lost. In August, he drafted a leaflet, quote, "The Aryan Paragraph in the Church," end quote. He immediately sent it to synods and congregations, hoping to influence the Berlin-Brandenburg Synod on August 24th and the General Synod on September 5th and 6th. Printed in bold type, the leaflet was modeled on Hildebrandt's Leaflet for the Church Election from the summer of 1933. Bonhoeffer's leaflet outlined the consequences of his April theses. Since, quote, "the exclusion of the Jewish Christians from the ecclesiastical community destroys the substance of the Church of Christ, there is but one way to serve the truth in a church that implements the Aryan Paragraph in this radical form, and that is, namely, to leave it. This is the last act of solidarity with my church, which I can serve in no way other than with the whole truth and all its consequences," end quote. Wow. So Bonhoeffer said if people refuse to support the confession that anybody can come to Jesus and be saved, then your only choice is to leave the church, right? If they won't accept that. That's really fascinating. This whole book is so fascinating to me. Bonhoeffer repeated his argument from April that when the freedom of the gospel is falsely made law, the demand of the weak becomes the prevailing law of the church. If the state's civil service law were applied to civil servants in the church, he continued, the office of ministry would become a privilege, which would threaten it profoundly. Any ministry based on privilege must necessarily lead a pastor who served the truth to resign his office. So if it's considered a privilege to be a pastor, i.e., you're not Jewish, you're not inferior, you are a privileged class. If you find a church that views it that way, you must resign the office if you are going to adhere to the truth. That's the point. Bonhoeffer's third point was that the July 11th, 1933 Reich Church Constitution, with its silence about the expulsion of non-Aryan students from the universities, had virtually abandoned a new generation of non-Aryan Christian theologians. Early 1933, like April 1933, is when the first anti-Semitic legislation really started coming out, and it just kept being pumped out. It was all over the place. One of the earliest pieces of legislation from the state that persecuted Jews was basically banning Jews from going to universities, because the claim is that, from Hitler, there were a disproportionate number of Jews and there weren't enough seats available for Germans. And this is part of the plot to blah, 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 you know how they do. So that's what they're referencing here. The Reich Church, when it created its constitution on July 11th, 1933, it was silent about that legislation about universities. And it was one of the earliest examples of a way in which the church could have spoken up. It's a really complicated subject because I believe in separation of church and state. Should the church have spoken up to stop this from happening? I'll talk about that more in another part, but I think the core problem here is that the church is, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, couldn't pick a side. When it was convenient, they controlled entire towns. When it was inconvenient, they pretended that they couldn't get involved in politics at all. If they had either not been involved in politics from the start or continued being involved and just kept on going, things would have played out differently. It was their selective choice to do things the way that they did them. It says, Bonhoeffer urged his readers to protest through sermons and by opening, quote, new doors to the ministry for Jewish Christians. If it, the church, does not do this, then it makes itself responsible for the entire Aryan paragraph, end quote. With his public and implacable demands, Bonhoeffer stood alone. So there was an oppositional group, is the point, within the church, the confederation, or the federation of all churches in the region. There was opposition, the confessing church, being made up of 2,000 pastors out of 18,000. That means it was about 10%, roughly, of the church total. But it wasn't even the church goers. It was the pastors. And additionally, those pastors didn't care about Jews. It was never about Jews again. Bonhoeffer, in his effort to help Jews, just for the sake of helping Jews, stood alone. He's like the only one out of 18,000 pastors who spoke out for them. And it wasn't dangerous to speak out at this point. Eventually, it would be. Eventually, Hitler would create kind of like an FBI that would investigate cases where people claimed that people were like oppositional to the Nazi cause. The Gestapo would investigate any denouncements, and kids would like denounce their teachers for assigning homework and stuff. You know, people get like 5 denouncements a day, and the Gestapo investigated every single one, every denouncement through the entirety of Germany. And if they had too many denouncements because like kids were using it flagrantly, they'd just hire more Gestapo agents. Anyway, that hadn't happened yet. Right now, we're talking about early 1933, when it was perfectly safe to speak out in favor of Jews. It would be like us right now in American history speaking out in favor of asylum seekers or Mexicans or whatever. There's no danger to that. I do that all the time. But literally none of the pastors, even in the confessing church, did that or stood for that. Only Bonhoeffer. I have no sympathy. None. For any of those people. I do not grant any kind of goodwill or whatever because they eventually came to their senses. I don't grant them anything for standing up for Jews who converted to Christianity rather than just Jews in general. I don't grant them anything. Okay, these people were colossal scumbags. They were vile pieces of trash, all of them, except Bonhoeffer, maybe. That's my point. So anytime you hear somebody say Hitler was an atheist and he did what he did for atheistic reasons and the church was opposed to Hitler and all that, no, they were not. Literally nobody in the church, nobody opposed Hitler. The Catholic Church had like 2 bishops that spoke negatively about Hitler at one point. And Bonhoeffer was the Protestant speaking out against him. That's it. And for the record, 95% of Germany was Christian. 3.5% were deists. They believed in God of some sort, but were, not really sure. And then 1.5% were atheists. 54% in Germany at the time were Protestant. 41% were Catholic, for a total of 95%. I'm pulling these numbers off the top of my head because I just read about it the other day. Anyway, 54% Protestant, 41% Catholic, 3.5% deist, 1.5% atheist in Germany. So we're talking 95% of the population was Christian. And they all stood for Hitler except 3 or 4 of those pastors or bishops. In America, 33% is Protestant, 22% is Catholic. 11% is non-specific Christian, probably evangelical, I would say, most likely. 2% Jewish, which is actually roughly the same percentage, give or take, in Germany. Jewish communities before the Nazi rise to power, 0.8% in Germany, 525,000 people, out of about 60 million, give or take. So we have a higher concentration of Jews in America than they did in Germany, 2%. Mormons, 1%, other religions, 6%. Unaffiliated with organized forms of religion in America, 22%, and no answer, 3%. So the point is, they were way more Christian in Germany at the time. If anything, this tells me that Christianity is not a source of moral truth. Christianity does not improve people's moral outlooks or views. And Christianity is, I venture as far as to say, always used to hurt political enemies. Anytime Christianity is used, it's always used by colossal scumbags trying to manipulate it from the outside. So you can say Hitler was an atheist if you want. Maybe, I don't know. But I can tell you for sure that Germany wasn't atheist. Germany almost entirely was Christian and entirely supported Hitler. So I don't want to hear it. Let me rephrase. They didn't entirely support Hitler. They entirely supported hatred of Jews. A lot of them didn't really support Hitler. A lot of people say Hitler was pagan. He was into the occult. No, he wasn't, actually. As it turns out, he wasn't. He's not into the occult. That's just made up by evangelicals who are dead set on turning Hitler into an atheist. He was Catholic, actually. However, I personally believe that he was likely non-religious, but he never gave us any indication publicly that that was the case. He always ever spoke positively about Christianity publicly. Himmler, one of Hitler's top people, one of four, basically. Himmler, the leader of the SS, which is like the police, basically, in Germany. He was pagan, I believe, or atheist, or both. Himmler tried to get people to believe in Valhalla instead of heaven. And Hitler said, that's stupid, we're not doing that. Anyway, tell me what you think about it in the comments. I'm so fascinated by this book. And I don't know if mine is out yet or not, but I have a book on this very subject myself. Check it out on Amazon, or you can go to like owenmorgan.com to find it, and it'll give you options to buy it, like Amazon and signed copies and whatever.